Welcome to Lunching with Lawyers, where I interview law graduates as to how they have built their inspiring careers on the foundations of their law degree. Sometimes I interview others who haven't needed a law degree to build a similarly inspiring career. Carolyn Bond has been a consumer advocate for more than 40 years. For many years, she was the CEO of the Consumer Credit Legal Centre and then the co-CEO of the Consumer Action Law Centre. Currently, she is the National Coordinator Economic Abuse Reference Group Project, facilitating the policy responses of community organisations to family violence and economic abuse. She is also the voice or the pen behind the Naysayer website, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Many who have heard of Carolyn would be surprised to learn that she's not a lawyer, particularly as she sat on the Legal Services Board of Victoria for 12 years, and given the impact she has had and continues to have on policy development for the marginalised in our community. Perhaps just as surprising, she has no university degree. Is that right?
I do have a graduate diploma in education and training. But that's it, Loretta.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to finding out more about Carolyn and how she managed to obtain such roles without what other people would think was really required to have such a career. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thanks, Loretta.
In your Ruby Hutchison address in 2013, you spoke about your parents and how they instilled financial management ideals into your life. I particularly like the story of your father having to give up cigarettes to save for a camera.
Yeah, I guess that sort of shows my age a little bit, doesn't it? Because, and I guess my mother didn't go to work till I was, at high school. She had a background as shorthand typist, but she stayed home till I was at high school. My dad had a trade job, so there wasn't a lot of income there. Basically, Dad was very happy for Mum to handle the money, and Mum was a very good money manager. And so he used to get $5 a week, pocket money out of his wage. Yes, and he was so into photography, and he wanted to buy a new camera. So my mother just suggested that if he gave up smoking, he could buy a camera, and it's what he did.
A good man. Well, it's a great thing when you have a partnership where one person does know how to manage money and the other, as long as the other partner is willing to actually have somebody have more of the control of that. But I think it's really important that both people have some idea about money management.
I think, and looking at the economic abuse work I do at the moment, there's a big difference between management and control.
Yes.
So if one party controls the decisions, that's a problem if the other person can't sort of play that role in making those decisions about how resources are spent. Having one person manage the money, sort of control and pay the bills if the other person is happy with that, then it's a different thing, and it's certainly what I saw growing up.
And taking that point, because a lot of the times we used to see a lot of women come out of very long-term relationships, even where there wasn't abuse, and couldn't manage anything, especially if their partners had passed away, didn't know how to pay a bill. And I don't think that's a good thing either. You have to have some oversight of what to do in terms of your financial affairs. You can't just leave it to someone else.
It's certainly a life skill that you need.
It's a life skill.
That everybody needs.
So what prompted you to leave home at 18 and get a job rather than going off to university?
Oh dear, this goes back a long way and takes me back to the angst of being a teenager who sort of knew it all and knew nothing. Yes, look, I left school. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I certainly probably didn't have much idea of what the sort of careers available. I think it's probably a little bit different these days at school. I started to do a business studies degree. But at the same time, I was feeling I wanted to sort of be more independent. Not great relationships with my parents, and I think that was all around being a bit of a sort of rebellious teenager. And so, yes, I just I went to Safeway, which is now called Woolworths. I already had a weekend job there, and I just said, "Have you got a full-time job?" And they said yes. And I just started doing that and moved into a bedsit with a friend who I worked with at Safeway. So yes, looking back, it was sort of a bit of a tough time for me and my parents, but it was probably the best thing I ever did. I think once I had to, earn my own money and decide, how I was going to eat and how I was going to pay the rent, I think it sort of really focused my mind on growing up pretty quickly.
I think I don't think it's a bad thing to leave home early. I wish some of our kids would leave home early too.
And it was easy. It was easier those days. You didn't have like the rents. It was easier to get a sort of permanent job if you wanted one. The rents were affordable. It was a different time.
Yeah, I think so. And you said that in those few years after you left school, you made a few attempts to get involved in stuff, but it never panned out. Why were you even interested in the first place?
Yeah, so look, I was lucky enough. After working at the supermarket for a few months, I landed a job that was a clerical job at a computer bureau, and I don't think there's any such thing now. But at the computer bureau, it used to run the computer programs for a lot of accounting firms, do a lot of payroll, because everything had to be done on a large mainframe computer. And so the details used to come in written on paper of the payroll. Someone would punch them into cards. They would then be fed through the big computer. There'd be a big printout, and that would be sort of delivered physically by a courier back to the company. And I've got a clerical job there. So just getting all, tape library, and again, sort of jobs that aren't there now, because people actually, people would say, one day everyone will have a computer at home. And I was looking at this big, enormous thing that sort of took the size of about 6 lounge rooms and thought, why would you want one? And I did, so I worked at the Computer Bureau. I worked at Swinburne University, just again, similar clerical job. And then I got a computer operating job for Commercial Bank of Australia, which merged to become Westpac. But again, doing there was no internet, all of that sort of thing. So at the time I was at the bank, I don't know, I just had an interest. I think my parents had generally had a sort of interest in, I suppose, sort of current affairs and what was, going on. I used to read The Age every morning, and that, that's not radical now, but everyone around you is sort of reading the sports pages at work. And I was just very interested in social issues. So, I made a couple of attempts. So I sort of thought, I really want to get involved somehow. And I saw in a community magazine that they were looking for volunteers to sort of help out with it was a North Melbourne neighbourhood program. And so I actually had a couple of weeks holiday. So I contacted them. And look, I think I sort of went and helped a disabled lady, get her shopping, and did a few things like that sort of community helping roles. And I can't remember, there was something else that I did just trying to get involved in sort of community, and nothing sort of really came of that. And until we moved out of a flat I was sharing with one of my work colleagues, and the landlord kept our bond.
Which would have been quite a bit for, young, struggling.
It was. And I think our bond was about $200, which was a lot of money in those days. And it was really, it was one of those flats where the walls were all painted white and you had the sort of very pale coloured carpet, and it was clear it was wear and tear, and they kept our bond for cleaning and repainting. And, I just got really angry about that. My girlfriend says, oh, they always do that. And I said, no, I'm going to take some action. And I actually looked up, the phone book, and I rang up what was called the Tenants Union at the time. And look, they gave me a bit of advice and come back if you need more help. So I then got a pamphlet in the mail where it was, you've got some help from the Tenants Union. If you'd like to volunteer to help, we always need people to volunteer, so contact us. Now, what was interesting is these days it's often hard to get, I think, a lot of volunteer roles, especially law students all want to volunteer at, advice services and at legal services because it helps these days with getting a job. It wasn't the case in those days. And what I didn't know was everybody who rang up the Tenants Union got a letter saying, can you come and volunteer?
You just thought you were special.
Can you come and volunteer? And so, yes, I started, because I was doing shift work at the bank, I'd go in once a week, either if I was on night shift or afternoon shift, I'd go in during the day, and I'd just be on the phones. And so quite quickly, I learned what to do and how to try and get your bond back. Mind you, that was hard because there was no tribunal, and in the end you had to go to the magistrate's court, so that wasn't easy. But so there weren't really easy solutions, but people were ringing up about evictions and things like that. And I quickly learnt the basic, the basic script and what to say. And so that was really, I guess, the start of me getting involved in some sort of community activity, but that also had a sort of, you could see the need for law reform. It wasn't just helping people, but it had that sort of law reform element as well.
How old were you then? How old would you have been then?
Yes, I was probably about 22 when I first went along there.
And so to have that sort of connection between what an individual complaint or an individual issue, but seeing the need for law reform, that's quite advanced in your thinking, it's quite sophisticated in your thinking. Why do you think you had that, and how then did those individual experiences translate into helping around a campaign, focusing on landlords keeping people's bonds?
Look, it's hard to know exactly what made me think that way. And I guess, just that interest I had, I think, in different social issues. I felt at that time it just wasn't, because it wasn't always people's fault that there were things wrong with the system. And it was pretty clear when you started talking to people and experiencing myself, my landlords kept my bond. What power did you have? Well, basically, you had to issue in the magistrate's court. And so you had to risk a lot of costs if you lost. Yeah. You had to put money into issuing, and what tenant wants to issue in the court if they don't have a lawyer and they have to represent themselves. And so the power was all really with the landlords, and the same with evictions too. I actually still think that the tenancy laws are very unfair to tenants still, but then it was even worse. And so it didn't take me very long in there to sort of think, well, gee, this is,
what can I do?
These sorts of things have to change. But I think, look, the other thing about the organisation, I was also lucky, I think, that that's where I went to get help.
Yeah.
Because I started then, they had a legal service, volunteer legal service operating on the Wednesday night, and I started helping out there. And again, they were so desperate for volunteers. They really didn't care if they were lawyers or, they were really putting the call out for anybody, which is pretty crazy when you think about it these days. But Michael Varis, who was running that at the time, you'd go along and you'd actually I'd be sitting with the lawyers or law students and giving people some advice. Mike Silvaris probably had a big impact on me then getting a lot of confidence, because it's crazy at the time, but, I said, we've written a letter of demand. What should we do now? Oh, well, the court summonses are in that, George. Just fill it out and you can go and issue it in the court, and the landlord lives near you, so this is how you serve the summons, And I'd actually gone along and said, oh, well, I can type. I can volunteer to type. But also you'd go along there, you'd be with all these young, enthusiastic people, volunteers, which was just lovely to find my tribe, I felt. And then you get to the end and then Mike Silvaris would say, who's coming to the, protest in front of this real estate agent on Saturday? And one large real estate agent was just automatically keeping everybody's bond. And so we went and had a little protest out the front and took in the mops and the brooms and went in there. And so I think it was also seen that, yes, it was almost a natural there
progression
that you actually, yes, you help individuals, but then what are we going to do? And we're going to have a demo, we're going to do a submission, we're going to lobby government. That was something that all went hand in hand.
So it was Mike that really was already thinking like that, more holistically about how to advance the interests of tenants, not just on an individual basis.
He'd been at the bar. He was a barrister who actually left the bar to sort of really start get the tenants union going. And he'd been a tenant himself where the whole block of, units had been treated badly. And he organised a bit of a march down their street or in front of the owner's property or something like that. So he was actually a barrister who'd become quite an active campaigning tenant on his own issue. So he was really he started with a view that, yes, things needed to change.
So obviously media was you used that very effectively to get your message across.
Media was one thing, but I also started at the time when there was a really big review of tenancy laws. And so, and in fact, there was a government had asked for submissions. And so one thing that was all being organised at the time and I took part in is to actually get ourselves understanding what the new laws were going to, proposed laws were going to be, and then for us to go and just I went to talk to social workers at different welfare agencies to encourage them to do submissions and to talk about why this was really important. So I think it's also that view that it's whatever tool you need. And so what happened was the government ended up getting a lot of submissions hoping for change to the tenancy laws. And they got a lot of submissions because I and others were going out and actually sort of lobbying social workers, community agencies, so they understood what was going on and so that they would make submissions.
And is that when you got a tribunal at that time?
Yes, those reforms it meant that those tenancy, that evictions and bond matters, there was a free tribunal rather than having the court, which was a big step.
It would have been a huge step. So, but you moved from there into financial counselling. How did you get to financial counselling from being an advocate in the tenants union? And what exactly is financial counselling for a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily know what it is?
No, and when I got into it, I didn't really know either. I've been in the right place at the right time. And, when I say that, I don't think you can plan to be in the right place at the right time. There's a lot of luck.
But I also think you've got to be in the place. Like, I think you do create your own luck. So you create your own opportunities and then you take those opportunities. I do think that is also true.
Yeah, look, I do think if you're a bit stuck, I think just doing something.
Yeah.
Some things work, some things don't.
Look at yourself. You tried a few things before you came to something that really started you on that path.
Yes, yeah. But, I'm certainly not so... I've had a lot of luck in my life and I think I think when you were successful, and I would say I'm successful in life. It depends, people have different sort of ways of judging that. But I know, when you're successful, I think you do tend, the temptation is to think, yes, it's because of what I've done. And I think, yes, that's part of it. But I've had a lot of opportunities a lot of people haven't had. But
for sure.
Yes, but
now back to the question about financial counselling.
So, look, I was probably volunteering at the Tenant Union, I don't know, at least for a couple of years. I obviously, my whole friendship network really was the volunteers, the other volunteers who I knew. I met someone there who I started going out with, and I'm now been married to for over 35 years or more. So it was really my network. And when you know people who are involved in community work in one area, they're often involved in another area as well. And so I found out through these people that, there's this financial counselling job being advertised in Footscray. And I said, what's financial counselling? And my husband Dennis sort of said to me, well, you know how we go and sue landlords and you sue summonses and all of that? Well, financial counselling is just the opposite. And
what did he mean by that?
Well, he meant that on one hand, we're suing the landlords, but financial counselling is really trying to help people who are being sued, I suppose, was the statement. But again, you've got to think back to the time, and I'll tell you a bit about what financial counselling is. But at the time, state government had recently started funding a financial counselling program. It was part of the family support program, so they funded family aides, social workers and financial counsellors. And I think the initial thought was people who would go and help disadvantaged people to budget better. And
when was this?
This was about 1980 or 81 I started. And so I think there were probably 5 positions in Victoria. I actually went and I was interviewed by a couple of people from the committee over in Footscray. Again, I just don't think many, it was seen to be something like, well, helping people budget or ringing up people you owe money to, or, it was pretty vague. But look, another reason why I got that job, I think, was it had less than 6 months funding left. And so no one knew whether it was going to be extended. So I'm not sure anyone else applied. But I guess it was, I was enthusiastic, and I guess I'd sort of probably done quite a bit of casework at the Tenants Union by that stage, understood a bit of that sort of advocating for, individual people. It's terrible to think of going into that role with how little I knew at the time, to be honest. But then there were only about 5 other financial counsellors around, and when I went and spoke to them about, well, what do you do in your job? They had one said, oh, well, I run a food co-op, and another one said, oh, well, I do more, sort of community development programs. Someone else was sort of like, well, I help people to budget so that to make sure they pay their debts off. So, it was really I felt it was left to the individuals to sort of work out what you were going to do. And it was pretty clear even at that time that you could either sort of take a strong advocacy role, seeing things are unfair, but advocating for people with finance companies that were often doing terrible things at the time, or at the other extreme, you could sit down and say, well, you need to budget your money and we need to make sure that you can pay off these terrible finance companies before you buy food. So, yes, it was really a tough thing to go into for the first year or so, really trying to work out what I was supposed to be doing.
And why didn't these people who had these money problems or were being sued, why didn't they just go to lawyers?
Yeah, look, really, that's a really interesting one. I suppose, first of all, you couldn't afford a private lawyer.
Yeah, for sure.
But when I started in this role, there were only, I think, 2 or 3 community legal services in Victoria. And what happened was Dennis, my husband, I think by that time, was a lawyer. He was working in, helping a lot of people with criminal matters. He tried to help. I'd say, well, can they repossess this car? Or they have this document that says that the finance company can repossess all the furniture this person owns. And he was trying to do some, legal research for me. But when I rang, you tried to contact, say, Fitzroy or, one of the few community legal centres, the lawyers dealt with crime. They had no idea. Yeah. So what happened then was that Dennis and I felt we'd seen how the tenants' union would give advice, and then they'd have a sort of legal service with legal volunteers. And we thought we really need something like this for financial counsellors. And at the same time, Paul Bingham was doing financial counselling. Bev, his partner, was doing financial counselling. Paul, I think, hadn't been admitted but had a law degree at that stage. And a few of us started talking and saying, how can we set up a legal service that can actually try and give legal advice and help us, so the financial counsellors could actually tell someone if they had to pay or not.
Yeah.
So we had a meeting of about half a dozen people in our house.
So who was there at that meeting?
At that meeting, there was Dennis and me. There was Bev and Paul, who I've mentioned. There were Dick Gross came along, who I hadn't met till then. Alison Maynard.
Oh, really?
Alison Maynard was Dennis and I and Alison were sharing a house, renting a house share at that stage.
So of course she would be there.
But we met her. I met her volunteering at the TU as well. So she was really interested. I think there was one other person. Don't know if we kept contact, but that was the group, and we said how do we start a legal service? And we wrote up a submission to legal aid. I think before we even did that, we actually started off with zero money. We did a submission to legal aid, and I think we got $2,000 for the 12 months. And that basically covered stamps.
All right.
No email, of course, or anything like that. No, so that covered our postage. And a community centre in North Melbourne allowed us to use their upstairs office on a Wednesday night. So we sort of rallied round. We found some volunteer lawyers. There was a few more financial counselling positions by that stage around. And so what we tried to do was, on the Wednesday night, when people would come in, they'd be interviewed by a financial counsellor and a lawyer together. And that was really useful, because often the lawyers would be sort of looking at the statutes and sort of trying to understand or work out exactly what could be done. But the financial counsellor would often be able to go, oh, this company does this, or this how this works, or, these are some
So
strategies.
they had the practical strategies as to how you might apply the law or any legal remedies that this person might have.
That's right.
Why hasn't that model been continued?
Look, I think it worked. It probably has in some areas. I mean, I think we've moved a long way. We now have a lot of lawyers who know and specialise in credit and debt, mostly in community legal centres. And we also have some financial counsellors who work within community legal centres. And I think where that happens, it works really well. Some of them interview together, some just work with the same client, but just in Victoria there's one legal centre that runs a program with a women's refuge, and they have a lawyer and a financial counsellor who are both helping those residents with their problems.
In fact, I think it's such a great model, Carolyn. I've always been interested in lawyers working together with financial counsellors, and that's in the legal aid sector as well, which is very unusual for legal aid, because generally legal aid just sees itself as the lawyers. But I think even that sector is moving towards having more of a holistic approach, so employing social workers and hopefully one day financial counsellors. But yes, I think it's a model that works really well, because lawyers, there's much fewer of them than there are financial counsellors, and financial counsellors are on the ground with clients. They can build up the relationship. The lawyers are there to provide I think they're really good at providing the backup and being able to say this is, probably they have more of a role now, I sometimes think, in providing the strategy, and it's the financial counsellors that are implementing that strategy that could be devised by a lawyer in the background who has knowledge of the law.
When it works well, it works really well. And it's probably worthwhile just saying at this point too that when we don't see financial counsellors coming in now these days going, what on earth is this role supposed to be? Because one of the things that I did sort of some years after I started financial counselling, there were more, I actually helped to do some of the training of financial counsellors and eventually contributed to the first diploma in financial counselling. And so now everyone in every financial counsellor in Australia has to have a diploma. And there are there's guidance and ethical. People do act sometimes a bit, differently, but it doesn't tend to be, let's do a budget and pay your debts. No. It's quite a strong advocacy role. And so financial counsellors generally will understand about, social security benefits. They'll know quite a lot about debt law, often more than debt and credit law, often more than your general solicitor would know. And they will advocate with whether it's, your energy company, your bank, and they're quite active in making complaints when there's breaches, and often quite successful in getting debts waived, either just on compassionate grounds, but then also of using AFCA, the financial ombudsman, and those sort of to actually get unfair contracts, reversed, things like that.
And I think it's just one of the things that has really struck me, the way in which financial counsellors can get those outcomes, particularly release on compassionate grounds, is all about the relationships that they've managed to build, both at an individual level but also at an organisational level, so that financiers respect what a financial counsellor is saying to them, that it's an accurate reflection of the client's position, both financial and all of the other things that might be going on in their life, which is just such a wonderful place for financial counselling to be in. I think it's really matured, and in a relatively short period of time. That was 40 years ago there was 5. Now there's probably 1,000 across the country. And it's a profession.
Yes.
It's changed from something where the role was up in the air to a profession in a very short period of time.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, look, it could have, gone a few different ways. I actually think one reason that they're so effective is because I think in the early days, and even now, if something is wrong, or a bank or an energy company or someone is doing something wrong, financial counsellors, often through their peak bodies or individually, will call them out. They'll call them out publicly, or they'll lodge complaints with regulators. And while some may have thought in the early days, if we upset the banks, they won't talk to us, or if we upset the energy companies, and you've sort of got to go cap in hand. In fact, I think the fact that there was strong advocacy, and there continues to be, I think has led to a respect for the sector. And if the sector says we have a problem with the way that a certain telco or energy company or bank is doing something, then we often find that there'll be the business will react.
It's a great thing. It's a really great lifelong achievement to have been involved in that development over so many years. I know that you went to the Consumer Credit Legal Service. Keep thinking, is it service or centre? Service. And I wanted to ask you about one of the campaigns that you were involved in, because this really reflects how, again, both the legal centre and the financial counsellors work together to make changes in terms of, bad practices. And one of those is now a debt collection company that's recently gone into administration. But what was that campaign all about?
So I think you're talking about Collection House, aren't you?
Yes.
And I just heard from you now that they've gone into liquidation. Yes, that was in the early days. I was running Consumer Credit Legal Service, which probably only had about half a dozen staff. It was quite small. I mean, interestingly, that would have been in the, that would have been in the maybe late 90s. So it's interesting. I got the job to run it then. It was probably something like 12 years after I'd been involved, in actually starting it up. But this was your fault, Loretta. Now, I don't know. So
I've forgotten all about it.
Yes, of course, you were at Legal Aid, and you were talking to me, and you were, saying, what are we going to do about Collection House? They're doing, and they're dodgy law firm, and, they're doing all these terrible things. And you obviously set me off because I then sort of said to you, well, send me your case studies, and I sent to other people, sent me case studies. And so with a bit of help from others, I basically wrote a report on everything that was wrong with Collection House's behaviour. So we had a report. At the same time, it's probably worthwhile noting, because I just think I always think casework and policy and reform stuff just works so closely together. At the same time, we had one of the lawyers had a Collection House case where Ms. Taylor, who was the client, had received a phone call out of the blue. The debt was statute barred. It was so long, if they'd sued her, she could have defended, but sort of caught her unawares and made some threats about what will happen if she doesn't pay, and said, we're from collecting this money. And
I think we'll pull out the lawyers bit, just in case they're still around.
No, they've been done.
They're done.
I'll just...
anyway. Okay, go.
Okay. This decision, by the way, is...
Yes, I love that decision.
And it's ALR. So anyway, I'll do that bit again. So they'd called up lawyers, we act for Collection House, you've got to pay. And so she gave them some money on her credit card immediately. She then came to see our lawyer, who sort of said, well, you did have a defence, you didn't have to pay, and said, we're going to go to the tribunal and see if we can get your money back. Now, it's interesting because generally our lawyers felt this was possibly a case we may not win, and I think it really shows that the important cases are always ones that are borderline, because if it's a definite winner, the company will withdraw.
Yes.
But... so at the same time I'm doing the report, this case is being run, and the tribunal ordered that Collection House repay the money to the client, and you can look at Taylor versus Collection House if anybody wants to look it up. And Collection House went to the appeal to the Supreme Court, and then they lost. That had a big impact because Collection House then they made an announcement to the stock exchange that Collection House would no longer collect any statute barred debts. At the same time, and just before that case was run, we published the report. Now, again, you do things differently these days, but I went into the ABC studios to do an interview on their consumer program the day before it was released, and they'd received all of these letters from ALR lawyers on behalf of Collection House talking about, if there's one thing wrong, we're going to sue you, this type of thing. The ABC was nervous. They made me nervous. And I tell you what, I had a night without sleeping before that report came out. I was pretty nervous by then. However, so what happened was that was on TV. The report was released. Collection House came and said, this was, wasn't right, it was not true. But in the end, I think they pretty much accepted, yes, it was true, and they really had to make some major changes.
And do you think that was what really changed the debt collection industry? Because it wasn't just them. There were others that were really egregious in their behaviour and the way that they were collecting debt. And was that around the time that the ACCC brought out their debt collection guidelines?
Yeah, so that was happening. I think what it did was it really brought debt collection at the time sort of really out into the public and out into the open. And that was the time that the ACCC held a big forum.
Yeah, I remember.
Up in Brisbane. Were you there? I was there.
Yeah.
You were there. And to work to talk about developing a debt collection guideline. And so, yes, I think all of those sorts of things combined. And so, yes, so the debt collection guideline first one was published. It's now the ACCC ASIC. It's combined guideline because ASIC now regulates some debt collection. And so, yes, I think it was like a lot of these things we do. It's a combination. It's a combination of a number of things that actually lead to change.
And it shows you the importance of relationships too, because, well, one, my relationship with you, because I was able to raise it in that sort of really informal setting, but also your relationship with financial counsellors, with the media, all sorts of people that meant that there was changes, and ultimately that somebody like the ACCC took that on board and really ran with it. I think they've done a really great job with those debt collection guidelines. I certainly have used them over the years.
I think that's right, and I think, also it's been interesting to see how things like that develop, because initially it's like, well, they're a guideline, like it's not legally enforceable, but then the banking code came in, and the banking code adopts that, and the banking code is enforceable because it's a contract between the customer, and so the AFCA, the Financial Ombudsman, uses that to determine what is good practice. So in the end, for a lot of consumers, that guideline is enforceable.
Oh, for sure. And I think I always said I can't remember the section of the legislation which it was based on, because it was about harassment and coercion in the Trade Practices Act.
That's right, I'm at Section 60 of the Trade Practices Act. I can't tell you what it is.
In the consumer, I can't either. I just remember saying, well, this is how, it would be interpreted in the courts. We'll use that for sure. Do you want to tell me can you think of any other, that was a campaign that I really enjoyed myself, but is there any other campaigns that were particularly enjoyable at Consumer Credit Legal Service?
Yeah, look, one of the campaigns that seemed to go for a long time was the one against Avco Finance. Now, I wasn't personally involved in the first campaign they had against them, and, I guess everything aligned with that one, and I think it's really worthwhile thinking about this one, because this was when Avco Finance took mortgages over all of the household items, and this would have been in the late 80s, and they took mortgages over everything, the carpet, the cot, whatever. Yeah. And the only reason they did that was because they were lending to people who had nothing else. And I remember as a financial counsellor in the early days and explaining to them that someone couldn't make their payment, and the person from the finance company said, well, where's the baby going to sleep without a cot? So this was the sort of, it was real blackmail securities, we called it. And I'm not taking any credit for this campaign, but the way that, I guess this is the beauty of the financial counsellors and the lawyers working together, is that sort of thinking about, well, hold on, Avco, they don't want this stuff. They don't want it, but it's worth everything to these borrowers who perhaps can't pay. And so they will go without food to pay Avco because they don't want to lose their vacuum cleaner and their knives and forks and everything out of the house. But to the company, it's worth nothing. And so what happened was the campaign was done with Consumer Credit Legal Service and some financial counsellors down in Geelong. And they had a number of clients who were really gutsy and were at risk of losing all of their furniture. And there were a few companies doing this. So on the news that morning, the radio news, it said a number of people are going to be delivering all of their household furniture to their finance company in Geelong because it's got a mortgage over it. And, of course, a number of companies were ringing up Consumer Credit going, is it us, is it us? And so basically it ended with removal van and a lot of people, including these people who owed the money, marching down the street in Geelong into AVCO's offices and unloading TVs, couches, whatever.
Yeah.
And, of course, AVCO, they didn't want the stuff.
No, of course not.
But it really put it back on those companies. If it's your mortgage, it's your stuff.
Yeah.
So we can deliver it to you. And that had a really immediate response. It ended up on the news on every news channel. And that was on the Friday, and on the Monday, the head of the finance conference, which was the peak body of finance companies, said they would not take those bills of sale, those mortgages again, and that they wouldn't enforce the current ones. So it was incredibly effective. Look, it was easier to get good outcomes in those days because things were just so bad.
Yes.
But I just think it's always shown me, to think about, well, hold on, but what does because they're threatening something, what do they really want to happen, and how can you turn the tables? Unfortunately, we then had to have another AVCO campaign when I was at Consumer Credit Legal Service in the late 90s. They continued to do some pretty bad stuff. They weren't doing the mortgages, but they were doing some other things that were quite unfair. But again, I think we did have an impact on what AVCO were doing that, and that was done really. We were involved. The main people running that was Legal Aid New South Wales and Consumers Federation of Australia. So, again, not just organisations working together locally, but also New South Wales had protests, and I think in other states, possibly Queensland as well. It was really a national campaign that time.
Yeah, no. I've been involved in a few of those. I started job sharing a position 22 years ago, and it was seen as very, novel. And there was a lot of, people felt quite uncomfortable about it because they thought, how could this work? And it did work. And particularly if you have a job where there is a casework, policy, consumer ed, media sort of role, how can you share that? Now, on top of that, so that was but no management, was quite difficult to get across. But you ended up being the co-CEO of Consumer Action Law Centre when it was first merged with the Consumer Law Centre in Victoria. And there was a management role as well. How did you sell that to the board at the time?
Yes. Look, I'm not sure the board really I'm sure they didn't like the idea to start with. Consumer Credit Legal Service was merging with Consumer Law Centre. There's a story around that. I was very supportive. I was running Consumer Credit Legal Service at the time. I was very supportive of the two merging into a bigger organisation. And look, I had reasonably young children at the time. And I sort of felt, look, I don't want to put my hand up and apply for what would be a full-time...
Over full-time work, probably.
Over full-time, big role, sort of growing a new centre. But Katrina, who had previously worked at Consumer Law Centre, was here because she was actually doing some work with Dennis at the time, and I was staying out of the way and letting them do their work, and she came and she just said to me, "Oh, are you applying for the job?" And I said, "No." I said, "Look, I don't want a sort of big full-time role at the moment." And Katrina, who sort of had a young child herself, just said, what about as a job share? So look, we applied. I don't think we were we applied as a job share. I don't think we were the first people offered the role. And in the end, the board, but they offered it to us, and they offered it to us as a 3-day per week each. So it was sort of a bit more than a job share. So it was like a 6-day a week job share, because they were concerned about the sort of the handing over, and exchanging of information. Katrina and I worked together very hard to sort of focus on how can we make this position work. I think we both were able to sort of not, I guess, to sort of put our egos behind a little bit and to think of how can we make, because it was important to both of us that the position worked. Yeah. I think one reason it worked and it helped was because you had a merger of 2 organisations, and I'd worked at one and Katrina had a past role at the other. And so I think as co-CEOs, we really signified the merger, and we sort of felt if we can work together really well and show that we're sort of a team working together, that might sort of help the merger, and I think it did a bit. I think, look, it's tough. We used to the amount that we'd have to sort of relate to each other. We just had an ongoing Word document that and it was an interesting discipline actually, and quite useful, that I had, that everything that happened, you'd just add to this document. So there's something for the person to look at. I think we sort of tried to make sure that when anything was happening or, with any member of staff, that we both knew, and it wasn't someone didn't have to go like, I'll wait till they're back, till Katrina's in. And I think, look, we were both, we sort of had, I think we had some different strengths. Katrina was a lawyer. She was a really good lawyer. But we both had a strong belief in getting change because of having casework and reform work integrated closely.
Yes.
That the lawyers had to understand that they weren't just expected to do to help individual people. That if you saw one person, there were hundreds with that problem.
Yes.
And that our duty as a government-funded organisation or a community organisation wasn't to say, well, if you find us and come through our front door, we'll help. But if you don't, we're not doing anything for you. And so we worked quite hard to get that integrated so that the policy staff would also have input to what cases got taken on.
Yes.
So it wasn't just who was the most in need of our help, but it was also which cases might help with reform. And look, it was a tough job. We did it for about 7 years. We also sort of planned together to leave the role. I didn't have anything to go to. Neither of us had anything to go to, but we did not want to leave. We gave the board a commitment, and this was really our decision to do this. We gave the board a commitment that if one of us left, that the other would vacate the role. We didn't want the organisation to be stuck having to employ part-time people. And in leaving, we made a bit of a plan to sort of set a date and sort of to vacate. And then Gerard Brodie, who was Director of Policy at the time, got that role. I think he's been in that role for 8 or 9 years and just done the most marvellous job.
He certainly has. But I was going to go back to the job share a little bit more because I'm really fascinated by it, and I think it's a model that can work, and it's particularly a model very attractive to women because in a lot of those roles they say you can't do it part-time, and when you've got small children you want something that's part-time. Did you then divide, so it looks like you made sure that you were cross-management so that if there were staffing issues, they could be dealt with during the whole week and you knew what was going on. But did you then try and divide your policy work a little bit more so that it wasn't like you were trying to do everything in your 3 days as separate islands or...
Yes, look, we did divide the policy work up a bit. So, probably energy policy was certainly Katrina's strength. And of course, the fact that she ended up working for the National Energy Regulator probably shows that. And some of the credit reporting, debt collection, some of those sorts of issues I would focus more on. Look, it did mean, though, that sometimes, and I guess, this is what you've got to decide if you're going for a job share. It's very difficult, I think, at that sort of level that you go, well, I only work Wednesday to Friday and there's a big conference on Monday and this is my special topic and, I can't speak or whatever. So we were both able to be somewhat flexible so that if something came up on our, in our area, but then also, it's also if you've got your policy staff and your director of policy and they're on top of those issues, then obviously delegating and allowing people, ensuring that those staff can do a lot of those things is important as well.
Yeah. Do you think, so at the moment, because all of us are working from home and we're having more flexible working arrangements, and I do agree about the need for flexibility. I was very lucky because even though I was working part-time for a lot of those years as well, I had my sister in the background who was doing a lot of the childcare. Do you think that there's similar issues being raised about flexible working conditions in relation to working from home, but more flexibility that are raised in a job share as well? And are we dealing with them better or how can we?
Oh, look, I think employers often need to catch up with the sorts of things that suit employees and that actually give them the choice of a wider range of people to employ. I think the working from home has really shown that there are a lot of roles that at least for part of the time can be done at home and can be done well, and some people are actually doing a lot more work at home than they were in the office. And I thought, look, I think it's always going to be a little bit slow with employees coming up with what they want and what they think will work, and perhaps employers accepting those changes. And I think we're seeing that with the working from home
phenomenon. Having such a strong policy and advocacy role as CEO of the Consumer Action Law Centre, defamation action would have been a real issue for you. And I mean, the story about the ABC was typical of what you would have probably had a few sleepless nights, not just about that one, but about others. How did you counter that? And do you think community organisations these days are as brave as they were 10 or 20 years ago, or they're really standing on the shoulders of the work that's been done before in this space?
I think the defamation issue is an interesting one. And let's face it, if someone wants to sue you for defamation, they'll sue you. It doesn't matter whether you've got a defence or whether it's really defamatory or not, they'll do it. The Consumer Action Board, we had a really strong board who really understood a lot about what we were trying to achieve. And I think while I was there, I think we had 2 or 3 threats of defamation. And the board really stood by. The Consumer Action Board was a very strong board. They really understood what the organisation was about. And when you think about it, if you think of a few of the, threatened action against us, we would put something up on our website about a company that was doing the wrong thing or a case that we were issuing against them. What's more easy than that company just getting their lawyers to write to our board and just say, we're going to sue you for defamation, please take that down.
Yes.
And we and the board agreed that if we just took something off our website or stopped talking about a business every time they wrote and said, we'll sue you if you don't take it down, then, what are we there for?
Yeah, exactly.
And in fact, there was one company that threatened to sue, and they weren't a big company. They offered, sort of coaching to year 12 students or something, but it was expensive. It was, could be high pressure. And we put something up on our website about our client taking action against this company and what the claim was. And that company, if you went and looked at any of the chat groups anywhere where that company had been mentioned, all it was removed because of legal reasons. So it's very easy to engage somebody for your company and go, you just go and find everybody who's running that Facebook page, who's running that, chat group, and you just say you're going to sue them and they'll remove it. So in the end, we were the only thing on the internet about this company was on our website, and they're saying, well, we're going to sue you. And our view was it's really important that information stays there. And so while you need to make sure that, that you're saying things that are truthful, that you're not embellishing, they're not embellishing that.
Usually we're downplaying what they're doing.
You're embellishing it. It's factual. You say what claims are being made. And, we got good legal advice about it. But that wasn't the only one. But there were a number. There was another one where about another debt collector, where I did a television interview about the conduct of this debt collector. They threatened to sue us as well. None of these things went ahead. Probably the worst one was where a company tried to take action against some of our individual staff. And that was sort of quite stressful and really difficult for staff. So, if you've got an organisation like this, you need a board that knows why it's important, that you do stuff in media, that's prepared to get legal advice, but then is also prepared to say, we will stand by
decision.
This decision, because if we're cowed by this threat, it's a message to everybody. Just threaten to sue us and we'll keep quiet.
So what makes an effective board member then of a community legal centre? Because now also there's so much competition to get on boards, isn't there, of community legal centres, and I sort of worry about it in some respects because the old boards as such often had very passionate individuals on those boards that really believed in the mission of that organisations, whereas now I see a lot of the professionalisation even of community boards, and yes, it can bring some benefits, but I also think it can bring some disadvantages because you might get boards that are more reluctant to be so brave, I think.
Or it might work in the opposite way. I mean, you could do a whole podcast on the on how you put one of these boards together of a community legal centre. I think that the days of having people from your local community coming together and really what was the old-fashioned sort of management committee is outdated.
Dead in the water.
Yep. And at Consumer Action, look, it was our view that now we serve Victoria and we serve Victorian consumers. We had a phone advice line. It's always run a phone advice line and given assistance to a lot of consumers. And our view was, look, generally, if you want, there's ways of finding out what's happening and, to the group that you're assisting. One way is through what's coming through your telephone advice. Another one is in the connections you have with other services, that are assisting people who might not have access to your services. But whether having someone who is a consumer who's had a bad experience sitting on your board and then having to make a decision about whether they want to take the risk of being sued and things like that is I just question that. And I think that legal centres generally, they're becoming bigger. Yes, they are becoming corporate's probably not the right word, but there's a number of legal services now that have got 40 plus staff, and you do need to have people on a board who really understand the role of a director, who know when it's the CEO's role and when to butt out because it's a management role, and what the board's role is in strategy and risk management, etc. And so at Consumer Action, the board was set up, and it still does look for people with various skills, but always people who have corporate governance skills, but people who have an interest and an understanding. They're not paid positions, these ones, so you are attracting people who are interested, but there's been a sort of a range of people, either CEOs from other community organisations, people who've had other perhaps experience in as a regulator, and maybe one or two people who've actually from the business side, but who are supportive of what Consumer Action.
It's so important to get your board right, and you do need to spend a bit of time on making sure that you get the right board. I couldn't.
It's absolutely vital. It's absolutely vital. I mean, if you take it back, and I'll just a story from the old days when a lawyer at a community legal centre went to the board and said, "Oh, we can't be seen protesting, or we can't be writing a complaint to the chief magistrate because we're professional lawyers. What will people think?" And something like that might make sense to a group of people who are sort of community people who want to do the right thing and help out with a community organisation. But you need a board who can really say, well, hold on, why are we here? What's our strategy?
Yeah, and that's where we're going to go.
Yes, we're a community legal centre, but what does that mean? What's our obligation to fight for reform?
Great answer. We've already been speaking for over an hour, Carolyn. So I thought what we should do is just talk about your role on the Economic Abuse Reference Group. Why is it necessary to have a national group, and what are you doing there? What are some of its achievements?
Yeah, so there was clearly, as you see, my background's not in family violence issues. But after the Royal Commission in Victoria into family violence, there were a lot of recommendations that related to sort of consumer and finance issues, focusing around the way that maybe energy bills or telco bills or, bank accounts and those sorts of things can be used as a weapon, I guess, in sort of controlling a person, and recognising that, all of these businesses can actually do things to reduce the harm to people who've experiencing abuse. And I think there'd been some awareness of the abuse of older people in a financial sense, and the banks had been aware of, looking out for someone bringing, an elderly person into the bank and trying to get them to withdraw money. But perhaps not as much understanding of that happening in sort of abusive intimate partner relationships. And the Royal Commission made a number of recommendations. So all of a sudden the banks are trying to do, guidelines on what they should do, and the energy companies. And a few community organisations said, we want to have input to this, but we don't all want to be sitting down, writing submissions and all of that. Can we have a project that will actually help us coordinate So it's coordinate our submissions and coordinate our input. So it just started with 5 organisations in Victoria. I came into a part-time role to help them coordinate their input. But it's really developed now to the stage of where, especially during lockdown where we had a lot of video and different sort of apps like that, there are financial counsellors and legal centres and family violence workers from other states who are involved. And we're not just responding now to what businesses are doing, but we're actually identifying problems and raising them with industry. So I'll give you just one example.
Yeah, it's a great example.
So insurance wasn't mentioned in the Royal Commission, but a lot of our community organisation members said, look, there's real problems with insurance. If someone burns the house down, in a family violence situation, and that person is a joint insured or has had a key to the house, then no one can claim because the insurer or someone who's invited to the house has caused the damage. And there are a lot of other insurance issues as well. But, it's, for example, if you have a joint account insurance, one person can cancel the insurance, which can sometimes be used by perpetrators. So we've been working with the insurance industry that's now got guidance. That big problem of the destroying property hasn't been totally solved. But if you look at your house insurance policy these days, you will probably see that there's a clause about damage that is done by another person who may be a co-insured or someone is invited if it's due to mental illness or family violence, and saying the insurer will consider making a payment. So that's just one thing, and so we're continuing to work on a lot of sort of different issues like that, and I'm hearing from, we have online meetings. We share a lot of documents, and we're able to share too some of the work that's been done in Victoria. So, for example, Victoria has had family violence guidance on energy issues for the last 4 or 5 years. Some of that work's been shared, and we're about to have that regulation nationally.
Oh, that's so excellent. Oh, and also, you're such a busy woman, besides all the things that you would do, like in terms of hobbies and things, which we won't have time to talk to today, but you're also, what I really wanted to talk about was that you are also the woman behind the naysayer.net website with its motto, if it's too good to be true, ... What is it and what do you talk about?
Yes, when I left Consumer Action Law Centre about 8 years ago, there were just a number of issues I'd seen that I was still cross about, and being cross is actually a bit of a driver. Some people call it passion. It's really just being cross. So I just started a blog, and it's The Naysayer, because if you haven't got that, I think it's a punk rock group.
All right.
The first thing I started writing about was Rick Otten, and Rick Otten was one of these sort of property wealth gurus, how to buy, sell property if you haven't got don't have any money, and buy a property without a bank, and how to make money as a sort of property investor if you haven't got any money. I'd been interested in him. I'd come across him first in the 1990s, but he was teaching all these people how to make money out of property. They were totally dodgy techniques. Many years later, he could not give one example of where it had actually worked to the federal court. But he was teaching a lot of students to do this, and they were out there really screwing, ripping off desperate homeowners who couldn't pay their mortgage and people who were desperate to buy property. And they were acting as intermediaries and exploiting people. So from the organisations I worked for, Consumer Credit Legal Service and Consumer Action, we often acted for the victims of these people. Rick Otten's name was never used. But because I'd started sort of looking on the internet and looking at what Rick Otten was about, I could say, hey, the dodgy person involved in this is a Rick Otten student. And then you say, oh, there's another problem with a different person that's a Rick Otten student, or that's the contract that Rick Otten sort of promotes. And so I started blogging about Rick what he was doing, a lot of this rent-to-buy house stuff, which eventually, the government has pretty much prohibited in Victoria after a lot of work by Consumer Action Law Centre. I just want something that when someone Googles Rick Otten, instead of just seeing all this wonderful stuff about people saying they're making a lot of money, to see what it was about. So I started writing about him. Now, some years later, the ACCC prosecuted Otten. I think the ACCC knew the real harm was in what his students were doing to other people. But there's nothing illegal about teaching other people how to rip people off.
Yeah.
And so they took action against Otten for misleading and deceptive conduct in relation to him marketing his boot camps and all of that sort of thing. And in fact, he was found guilty. He and his company were fined $18 million, which at the time was an Australian record. And he was banned from teaching about property for 10 years, and that really, he wouldn't have been able to operate in the UK either, which he'd started to operate in. And I think he's now living in the States.
Do you know if he's doing the same thing over there?
I don't think he's doing the same thing. He's basically sort of trying to market himself as a bit of a sort of sales guru, which he probably is in a way. And this is what was so creepy about what he taught. How do you build rapport with people who are desperate and think they're going to lose their home and all of this sort of stuff. So, but I suspect the fine and the ban has had quite an impact. But I then blogged about a few other issues, but I also came across a woman who's doing very similar to what Rick Otten was doing. I won't name her here.
Yeah.
I name her on my website. She's recently been unable to practice law, so she's had a legal practicing certificate until recently, and ASIC have banned her from managing a financial advice or sort of provision of credit. But I think what I'm really interested in with both of these people is the fact that what they teach their students, the strategies are bad enough, because they're not fair. But it's, you're really helping people by taking a power of attorney from someone who's desperate, who can't pay their mortgage, who has no independent legal advice, but get them to give you a power of attorney so you can control their property and sell it and keep all the profit. But it's the don't listen to friends and family because they'll just knock you down, they're dream stealers. Don't ask a lawyer if these deals will work because a lawyer won't understand. Don't ask an accountant if this works. Just because you make a mistake, just because things don't work out, just keep going because, everybody makes mistakes. But I feel that with really what's happening is people are being conditioned to really lose all concept of what's ethical and what's not and what's legal. If you're not going to listen to a lawyer unless they're a lawyer that person recommends, if you're not going to listen to a lawyer telling you this is really high risk, then you're going to be in trouble. And quite a lot of Rick Otten students have been. And I was actually just in court last week watching one of his students. She's about to be sentenced for fraud. And I really felt that in her case, he didn't tell her to go and defraud the bank. But so much of what she was doing over years was unethical.
Yeah.
And
it's just little steps going down that path.
She was feted, she was on stage, she was the doctor of real estate, my chief mentor, all of this sort of stuff. And I suspect that it's very easy just to go down that sort of path. And this woman I blog about tells people to lie to AFCA, tell them you're a friend and you're trying to help. Don't tell them that you've got a power of attorney and you're trying to profit from this consumer. And so it's the same sort of thing. And I wonder, well, the students who are, at her workshop today in Brisbane, actually, there's one, you're missing out on something up there. But, what makes them think that they'll go, oh yes, well, she's lying about this and she's,
and it's really hard sometimes to counter that, particularly when people have bought that message. It reminds me very much of people who come to me and are convinced about the bills of exchange, where they can give a bill of exchange. Sovereign citizen stuff.
Yeah.
And it's so sad. And, when you think about it, they come and they're nearly bankrupt or they're just about to lose their homes, and they're still saying the sovereign citizen arguments. And I say to them, sometimes I just say to them, well, how has that worked for you? It might all be true, but how's that going to save your house? And I think it's it's just so sad to see those people, because they're the ones actually that have got some realisation that perhaps things haven't worked. But there would be so many people who never go and seek any help at all on that sovereign citizen arguments.
I think some of the psychology is the same. Yeah. And it was interesting when a number of Otton students got into trouble and they were prosecuted in Western Australia. He gave these comments that, oh, look, I've been over and talked to the government because they've just changed the law and it doesn't really work. Well, they hadn't changed the law for 40 years.
No.
I mean, it's just total rubbish. But it was sort of like, and then he says, I've gone and talked to the government. Well, actually, he had to sign an enforceable undertaking over there with Consumer Affairs. So, talking to the government probably meant, an interview with the regulator. But by writing it off as, they've just changed the law and, isn't that sort of silly sort of thing? People are like, well, you don't take it that seriously that we're doing what he says and we're actually breaking the law.
Yeah, no. It's also, it often shows me about how you can simply frame things differently and put a different spin onto it that turns what is signing an enforceable undertaking and very negative experience into something that's a selling point. It's ridiculous.
I know. I think he says, I was invited to talk with the government. And I thought, that's a lovely way to say that Consumer Affairs are basically saying, we'll prosecute you if you don't sign this document.
Don't turn up. So you talked a little bit about luck beforehand and that you've been a really lucky woman, and which is a really lovely thing, and it really reflects, though, the quality and strength of your relationships with people over the years, and because otherwise you may not have had those opportunities. So what is your strategy for building and maintaining those close relationships over years now?
I don't know. I don't know whether there's any sort of secret to it. I think one thing that's worked for me but might not work for other women in their careers. So it's not advice. It's just has worked for me. Is I've always been prepared to, if other people want to take credit for something I've done. I've sort of been like, yeah, that's cool. I think I haven't, in a lot of ways, I haven't pushed myself forward, but I think that probably depends how you do it. So I know even when we were talking about Collection House, in those really old days, we often used to say, someone in New South Wales, who wants to write this submission? Who wants to put their name on this? I'll do all the work, but we'll put 3 names on it. And I think probably the consumer sector it's not me, it's sort of more the consumer sector, I think, has been very supportive in that way. There hasn't been a lot of people like going, why haven't I got the credit because I've done all this work? And so, look, I suppose I sort of bought into that in a way, and for me it's worked because I've found that, if you put in a bit of work and other people get credit, then they're often coming back and asking you to do something that will raise your profile.
Yes.
That won't work in all sectors. It won't work in all jobs. And, I think it'd be terrible to say, give advice to women to don't take credit for the work you've done. But I think it does depend it depends a bit on the culture of the sector you're in. And for me, that seems to have worked. And I think generally as a sector, it is very collaborative. I think there'd be a lot of people who I've worked with who still connect with a lot of other people. The other thing that I have done too is I have stayed in the same sector for about 40 years.
That's true.
And, look, there are some reasons, and perhaps if I had more formal qualifications, I might have thought I'm mobile, I've got a law degree, I might specialise in something else. And so perhaps in some ways the fact that my strength is in my experience.
Yes.
I couldn't it's not something I can move very far. I mean, interestingly, I've really moved it into the sort of family violence, economic abuse space, but then a lot of that still relies on a lot of the contacts I made as in consumer advocacy are the same people in the banks and the regulators that I'm talking to in relation to the economic abuse.
Great answer. In fact, it's a really nice answer. And, it just shows you that, well, one, it really reflects that you can achieve great things even without a university degree, which most people would think was pretty critical for a career like yours, having said that. But it also shows some of the limitations that it can then make it more difficult to move if you wanted to do something else, because people, when you're in a new area, look for that at the start. Well, what are your qualifications? They do want that as the base.
Yes, and it look harder to do these days for young people to do these days, I think. And look, probably lucky I've never even thought I would have liked to have moved. So.
No, I wouldn't like to move either. I did try once and I thought, I'll just get me back to credit as soon as you can. I think it might be a nice way to stop. It's a place to stop. If you want to find out more about Carolyn, check out the Encyclopedia of Women and Leadership in 20th Century Australia. I'll put a link into the show notes, and the transcripts of Carolyn's speech at the 2013 Ruby Hutchinson address. Links, like I said, links to each I will include in the show notes. Thank you, Carolyn, for sparing the time to speak to me. If you want to find out more about each of my guests, there are show notes with each of my episodes, including contact details for each of my guests on my website, www.lorettacreek.com. Please drop me a line if you have any questions or know of someone who may be interested in being interviewed for this podcast. Until next time, thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Loretta.